state claim land through those three filters, I think the conclusion is that it's not owned by taxpayers. It's certainly not owned by the state. It actually remains unowned. And
can I stop you for a second, Simon? So, just to make sure, so here I'm not trying to like blow you up. I just want to clarify. So I totally get what you're saying, but it seems to me there's an interesting scenario that you're stepping over here that it could arguably be quite relevant. So what happens if the government taxes the taxpayers against their will, so has a bunch of money, and then it goes to a clearly legitimate owner of some land and gives the owner the money, and the owner voluntarily sells the government the land in exchange for the money?
No, that's a very good point. I think, because the question's often, I've seen asked, can the state ever own property legitimately? And I think the answer is the state can own property from a voluntary transfer, but it can't from homesteading. So, and the reason I say that is voluntary transfers, the key criterion is the intention of the transferor. So if someone intended to convey title of the land to the state, I think that's valid. I mean, they could do it as a gift without receiving any compensation, or they could receive compensation, but the state can never homestead land because it's not using peaceful means. So, to the extent that you're right, to the extent there is land that has been voluntarily transferred by the prior legitimate owner of the state could own that. The problem I have with that is, in practice, because we're talking about what is a voluntary transfer, and if the government comes to you and says, "Hey, I want to buy your land," the question is there the implication of pressure or duress or threats of eminent domain, etc. So, but I do agree in theory, if that's not present, that there could be some land that.
Can I ask a different one?
But can I?
Okay, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
So just to finish that thought, to the extent that is the case, then the state would legitimately own the land, not the taxpayers.
Okay. What like the Strategic Petroleum Reserve of the United States, the SPR, the government maintains stockpiles of crude oil being buried in salt caverns and stuff. So, am I correct in saying you're not claiming that those barrels of crude oil in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve are virgin, unowned assets waiting to be homesteaded?
Okay, so let me answer that with 2 points. One is we need to assume that it was voluntarily acquired. The state didn't pass a regulation saying that all oil, for every barrel of oil, 10% has to go into the reserves. Okay, sure. So we have to assume that. The other point I would note is, to the extent the state does legitimately acquire property through a voluntary transfer, it's actually you could look at it as a temporary or unstable ownership, because now that the state owns property, if taxpayers were to sue the state for return of their stolen income, and the state couldn't or didn't return it, then yes, the taxpayers could go against that property. So the state could own property in that respect, but it could be temporary.
Oh, okay. All right. So go ahead.
Right. So leaving that particular aspect to the side for a second, I think the other interesting part about state claimed land is, in the case of state seized land, I think everyone would agree that the prior owner owns it. But in the case of state seized land, the state has also stolen the income of taxpayers to create the means to seize the land. So that there's the same wrong that's being committed as in the case of state claimed land. But in the case of state seized land, I don't see anyone saying, well, therefore the taxpayers also have an interest in the state seized land, right? So, but if they don't have an interest in the state seized land, then why would they have it in the case of state claimed land? Because it's the same wrong, and you'd be looking at the same remedy.
Can I ask you, so I want to make sure just to distinguish. So let's say there's a local crime gang, and they come and they steal $1,000 from the business owner. Maybe they say it'd be a shame if something happened to your place here. If you gave us $1,000, we can make sure that nothing bad happens, and everyone understands what's going on. The guy gives them $1,000, and then if they go and spend the money, I don't know, buying jewelry for their girlfriend, and there was no coercion to stimulate in the jewelry sale. Are you saying the original business owner has no claim on the jewelry?
No, I'm saying that the mafioso would own that jewelry because the seller of the jewelry intended to transfer title to the mafioso. But if the business owner had been extorted, were to sue the mafioso, because that property is the mafioso's, the business owner could actually claim the jewelry, he could sue for his money back or for the jewelry. But in either case, I think again that's why I say the ownership of the mafioso would be temporary in most cases.
Okay, right. And then just one more tweak. So now suppose he leaned on the first guy as before, got the $1,000 in cash. He's walking, he goes into the jeweler and does the same thing and says, "Oh wow, that's a beautiful necklace. My broad would like that. Just as a sign of your goodwill and the fact that we're doing such a good job in the neighborhood, can I have that and give it?" checks out. And so he has both $1,000 and the jewelry. So I'm comfortable saying clearly the first guy that lost 1,000, even if the guy goes, the mafioso goes and gambles it away, the money, the cash, I can see why the first guy, even a libertarian judge, would not award the first guy the jewelry as compensation, because he'd say, well, no, that was stolen too. Whereas if it had been legitimately purchased, then I could see the judge ruling, strictly speaking, the best thing would be to give you $1,000 in cash, but since he doesn't have it, but he's got that jewelry, he'll give him that instead. Are you okay with at least the broad features of what I just said?
I am.
Okay.
And then just to finish up on this legal part, there's actually support. When Rothbard in Ethics of Liberty talks about land titles related to oil concessions, and he talks about frontier settlements, he makes some explicit statements about the fact that regardless of government claim to own the land and be able to control it, it's actually open for homesteading by others. So there's that support in Rothbard in a different context. And then similarly, Hopper actually, I think, contradicts his own position on immigration when he's writing about desocialization in East Germany. Because remember, on immigration, Hopper is saying that taxpayers own public property. When it comes to desocialization, he is quite explicit that when you're privatizing land or any property as a socialist economy becomes market-oriented, he says that it would be immoral and inefficient for everybody in the country to get a share of that property. In fact, he's in favor of what he calls syndicalism, where the users of the property would be the homesteaders. So if there were a state-owned factory that was being destatized, the factory workers would own it. But the reason I think that's a contradictory to his position on immigration is it seems to me in socialism that you're being taxed 100%, right? You don't keep any of the fruits of your labor. You can't even query whether you can even use your body as you see fit. So I look at the population in a socialist economy as being taxed at the rate of 100%, whereas in a market-oriented economy, maybe it's 30 to 40%. And so I don't see why. It seems like what Hopper is saying in the case of immigration, the taxpayers own that property, but in the case of desocialization, the taxpayers don't, the users do. So there's a bit of a contradiction there in his writings in different contexts, I agree.
Okay, let me just, Simon, I'll read it because I know it's taken from your paper, I'll read the quote. So I agree with you, Simon, without seeing more of the context, and folks, obviously, I encourage you to go read Simon's paper and see the exact details and judge for yourself. You're right, you have some quotes from Rothbard about, like, if a multinational oil company comes into some underdeveloped country and starts drilling for oil, that they're homesteading it, as opposed, and that does seem hard. Just like I get why Rothbard thinks the local, government run by a bunch of thugs isn't the rightful owner, but on the other hand, it's not obvious why he's calling that unowned, because didn't the local government steal that from the people who lived there all along, not the multinational oil company coming in. So I get, Simon, why you think there's a tension with Rothbard's views on that, and then at least the later Rothbard's views on the grade. But the Hobbit thing, let me just read it. I don't think there's a contradiction here. We can, I'll read it and let you push back if you want, but let me just say what I think Hopper's getting at. So he says, this is Hopper, folks, in Simon's paper. More specifically, all original property titles should be immediately recognized, regardless of whether they're presently held by East or West Germans. So he's talking about the fall of, the Berlin Wall and everything, and how do we privatize coming back from communism. Insofar as the claims of original private owners or their heirs clash with those of the current asset users, the former should in principle override the latter. Regarding governmentally controlled resources that are not reclaimed in this way, syndicalist ideas should be implemented. Assets should become owned immediately by those who use them. The farmland by the farmers, the factories by the workers, the streets by the street workers, the schools by the teachers, the bureaus by the bureaucrats, and he's got in parentheses, insofar as they're not subject to criminal prosecution, and so on, ... Moreover, our syndicalist proposal is economically more efficient than the only conceivable privatization alternative in line with the basic requirement of justice. According to the latter alternative, the entire population would receive equal shares in all the country's assets not reclaimed by an original expropriated owner. Aside from the questionable moral quality of this policy, it would be extremely inefficient. Okay, so that's the quote. So I think what he's getting at there is to say, yes, if somebody could prove definitively that, yeah, the Soviets or the East German government or whatever took my grandpa's house 30 years ago, then clearly it should be given back, to the heir. But absent something, if there's just some car factory that was built, by the comrades, collectivized labor and everything over the years, and now there have been East Germans going in and out of this car factory, cranking out cars. Well, who should get it? Hop is saying, well, the people who've been working there day in and day out, they should get it, not just the East Germans as a collective, because there's lots of people in East Germany who had nothing to do with that particular car factory. And so absent some direct demonstrable claim, like it was seized from, somebody originally when the communists took over, it should go to the people who are the most tied to it. And he's saying he thinks that would be more moral, but clearly more efficient than just kind of saying, oh, every East German gets a per capita share in all the different industries and farmland, everything going on. He thinks, no, let them, who knows best how to manage the farms right now on day one of the revolution? Well, the people who've been working the farms all along. So I think that's what he's saying. To me, that doesn't seem contradictory, but Simon, go ahead, and if you think that, do you disagree with my interpretation?
I do. I mean, let's leave aside the state seized land. I think there's no disagreement there. If you can show it was your grandfather's property, then it is yours. But I think when he's talking about land besides that, where there are no historical claims, again, I think the whole population are taxpayers in a socialist economy. They're just being taxed at a higher rate than in a market-oriented economy. So that's why I think he's saying taxpayers in a market-oriented economy own state claim land, but taxpayers in a desocializing economy don't own state claim land. Instead, the users do. I mean, I don't know if that means the Customs and Border Patrol officers would own the state claim land, or in the US or whatever. But it just seems like he's overlooking the fact that the general population are taxpayers in a socialist economy.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, I understand the point. Again, which one last thing just to clarify. I think I haven't talked with Hoppe on this topic per se, but my guess is he would say something to you like, well, yeah, if it's a money-using capitalist market, interventionist but market economy, typically what the government does is it broadly taxes people and then, quote, voluntarily, with its stolen funds, enters the voluntary marketplace and, builds a factory. If people are working in a, quote, socialized car factory in the United States or whatever, they're not slaves. It's not slave labor. They're being paid market wages to, bid them away from other private sector uses. And so I think that's why he's thinking the taxpayers are more just the owners per se, whereas in a truly communist society, then it's like who actually built a car factory. Well, it's not the broad public because they were taxed. It's more like, no, the people who actually at gunpoint were ordered, go build that thing and you go in there and make cars, comrade, and that's your part in the cog.
I mean, you could argue,
I think that's where he's coming from.
I agree that's where he's coming from. I mean, you could argue the taxpayers in the market-oriented economy did nothing to deserve ownership of the land either. They just had their income stolen. I mean, Rothbard does say that slavery is a 100% tax, and so that was what got me thinking that socialism is 100% tax. So anyway.
Okay, just so you understand the sound where I'm coming from. That's why I stopped you earlier to clarify. So we would have to see empirically with some of these things historically how did the state come to claim ownership. But I think that's why I was going through the whole thing about the mafioso. So I think the idea is if a lot of what this current government property is was actually because it raised general funds through taxation, running the printing press, and then went out and purchased most of it voluntarily, given that it was using stolen money, then that's different from if, they steal a bunch of taxpayer money and they also go around grabbing stuff, through just literal expropriation of the assets.
I would agree. I mean, I agree there is that third category. I think it's probably less relevant to the border and the land near the border, but it could well exist. And I also think, I think there's a heavy inquiry into whether it was really a voluntary transfer. But yes, I think in theory.
Okay, yeah. So I think we're fairly close on the basic theory, and now a lot of this is going to turn into, okay, in practice, what does all this theory mean vis-a-vis the immigration question?
Right. So let's turn to that, because the implication from these libertarians is because the taxpayers own public property, and we have a state, or while we have a state, then the state should manage that property. Again, there are different formulations on behalf of taxpayers, as trustee for taxpayers, or as a private owner would manage. And I actually think I've got sort of 5 reasons why I think that advocating for that is really contrary to common libertarian positions in other areas. So,
just so I'm mapping this, like if we're judging a debate here, are you now in the second bucket?
Yes.
And these are 5 points within bucket number 2? Okay.
Yes, I'm dealing with the problems I have with the whole management theory about the state managing public property. So, the first one is that as libertarians, our end goal is the elimination of the state. As ANCAP libertarians, our end goal is the elimination of the state. And we should all be advocating for fewer state violations and less state power, not more violations and more state power. And with immigration comes a massive immigration state, right? So you've got armed officers running around, they board Greyhound buses to check papers, they raid employers' businesses. The courts have defined the border as including 100 miles inland, which basically, I think, probably touches every state in the US. And so, you've got funding and bureaucracy. So it seems weird for libertarians to be advocating that position. And in fact, what they'd be advocating is an enlarged immigration police state. And note that the immigration police state doesn't just have implications for immigrants. It also, I think, violates the rights of citizens, because it prevents citizens from freely employing immigrants, renting renting to immigrants, having personal relationships with immigrants. So, and I think when Rothbard, when he was writing in For a New Liberty on destatization, he was saying that our message should always be consistent with our principles, that basically you should only advocate things that are on the path towards your end point, and not deviate from that path. I guess the other point I would make in this respect is, Jacob Hornberger writes a lot on immigration and the libertarian position, and he makes the point that libertarians should always be for abolition, not reform, and which is there's a bit of an irony because Hornberger is not actually an ANCAP, but he gives the example of, think about slavery. I mean, I've seen statistics that, in the antebellum period, maybe only 1 to 2% of the population were actually abolitionists. And can you imagine if the abolitionists, instead of pounding the table for abolition, were saying, look, slavery is cruel, so let's reform it. Instead of 30 lashes a day for wrongdoing, just 10 lashes a day. Well, sure, that'd be much better for the slaves, but would we ever have gotten to abolition of slavery if we weren't a group pounding the table for it? And Hornberger often says, we have conservatives to argue for reform. If libertarians want to add something to the debate, they should be steadfast arguing for abolition. So I think these libertarians are actually asking for reform of the immigration police state, just a different policy. So that's why, for all those reasons, I think I would call it unlibertarian to argue for an enhanced immigration police state.
Okay, so maybe just on that one, and again, folks, my point here is not to tackle Simon, but just to give him the obvious, what to me is the obvious pushback that I think Dave, or somebody in his shoes would give this point. So I think Dave could rightly say to you, Simon, oh right, the analog from I am an abolitionist. I don't want there to be government agents searching buses and putting up fences. My ultimate goal is complete abolition of the state. That's the ideal. And private property for everybody, that's the goal. And I will say that, and if I could vote for that tomorrow, I would vote for that. But that's not what's going to happen. And so now we're all just arguing over the second best alternative. And for people claiming to be open borders libertarians, I don't know if you use that phrase, Simon, but they're not merely saying, hey, the government should just get out of this altogether. For example, a lot of people are saying, and Chris Freeman was one of them, I pinned him down on Twitter about this, he thinks the federal government shouldn't merely say we have nothing to do with immigration, but no, if they see agents of the Texas government or whatever, National Guard, under there, putting up a fence, then the agents of the federal government should go down and tear the fence down. So it's not merely, hey, let's just get out of this and do nothing. It's actively intervening. So it's using the powers of the government to implement open borders, as opposed, so anyway, I guess it's a reason to let you respond to that.
Right, so this second best alternative, I agree. I was going to deal with this later under the justifications, but I'll deal with it now. Yes, these libertarians would say we don't want a state, but while we have a state, the second best alternative is to have the state managing the border. But I feel like that's distracting. As a libertarian, that's distracting from the core wrong here, which is state power. I mean, play that out. Let's take the invasion of Iraq. So, these libertarians, to be consistent, would say, sure, the US government should not have invaded Iraq, but while it's there and controlling Baghdad, it should definitely be able to set a policy of shooting males between 18 to 35 if they violate the 6 p.m. curfew, because a private property owner would take steps to repel or shoot dangerous trespassers if they were going to threaten the people on the property that the private property owner cares about. So, or you could take the education system. You could say, sure, we don't want the state involved in education, but while we have a state, this is the curriculum they should put in place. So again, I'm not disputing that they are abolitionists in a sense, but their message is not hack away and get rid of the immigration police state. It's reform it and it's do things but it's a message that I don't think is in accordance with libertarian principles.
Okay, so here, just because this is so relevant, let me push back on this one. But again, Simon, I do want to give you plenty of time to make your position. But on this one, I'm pretty sure Dave, because I've heard him deal with it. So I think Dave would say, and again, folks, here, Dave thinks he's just, recapitulating what he learned. Because his view is Dave used to be an open borders kind of guy, saying this is just an arbitrary line on a map. I don't want agents of the state telling people what they can do. And then he's come around. So his point, Simon, is to say, yes, in terms of second best or whatever, and not introducing more aggression into the equation, under no circumstances would the policy be that the government is allowed to initiate new aggression on people. But where he's coming from is to say it's not the case that somebody from Denmark or from Guatemala has a libertarian right to walk into the current landmass of the United States. Whereas, like you said, the case of somebody living, some kid in Baghdad, if U.S. troops go over there and just shoot him in the head, well, then they clearly have violated, that his body was his. Whereas it's not the case that if somebody stops somebody from entering into Texas, just, you know, a priori without more information, that they're violating his rights. You don't have a right to just walk around wherever you want, whereas you do own your body is the default position. So I think that's how he would distinguish it. Then you said the thing about the schools, and I think Dave would say, yeah, that's not a reductive answer. You're right. I do think if the schools are going to start teaching Satanism and transgender stuff, or teach times tables and that you should listen to your parents and not do drugs, then I think he would say, yeah, clearly, how could we not prefer the latter? You're saying that no, the libertarians should just say, no, just privatize the schools and that's it, and let other people dictate what the curricula are. Well, you know, it wouldn't be, though, to say, well, given that we have schools, yes, the teachers can go and smack kids in the head and cause them to bleed, because then that's clearly a violation, but it's not that you have a right to be taught Satanism at school. So if the libertarian says, no, I don't want public school teachers teaching that, it's violating somebody's rights. So I think that's the way